Hello, welcome to Martial Opera's Oral History Project. I'm mezzo-soprano Micaela Aldridge, and I'm interviewing composer Robert Livingston Aldridge, who also happens to be my dad. So, how are you today?
Great, Michaela. Yes, so my name is Bob Aldridge, and I'm one of the composers. Honored to be in this project, and I think we're the only related uh, performer composer in this group, or maybe in the whole series.
Mhm.
Michaela is my favorite mezzo, and she's also my only daughter, so it makes for a good um, pairing.
All right, so I know a lot of the answers to these questions, but for those of you watching who don't, so just give us a little bit of background info. What was your relationship to music, and what led you to start composing?
So I came to composing late, relative to I think a lot of people. I was always playing music at home. I played the guitar pretty early. I played folk music, and then I got into rock music. Played in rock bands in college. Got into jazz. I was in played country western also in college, and so I had a variety of music. Also, as you know, my father is from North Carolina in the mountains, so I grew up with a lot of gospel music and bluegrass. So it was, I would say, I had a very full musical upbringing, and then my mom was a very good classical pianist. So that's where I've heard, Gershwin and Rachmaninoff and Beethoven and all of those things. So I came from a very eclectic background. I was an English major in college,
Mm-hmm.
and then towards the end of my time in at Madison, Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, I became I started taking music classes, and I became very much interested. And by the time I graduated with an English degree, I had already decided that I wanted my future to be in music. So that's when I started composing.
So, um, so you've written a lot of different mediums for a lot of different mediums in composing, but what inspired you to compose opera and just vocal music? If like of all the things that you could have done with with music, what inspired you to start doing opera?
Well, I started late with opera too because I didn't think that I would be a operatic composer or even a vocal composer. I wrote a set of songs early in my 20s, and then really only instrumental music mostly. And then I came up with the idea for Elmer Gantry, which was a famous novel by Sinclair Lewis, and also a very good movie with Burt Lancaster. He won the Academy Award in 1960. So the book was 1927 and the movie was 1960. It had a lot of resonance for me because my father was a Southern Baptist minister who became Presbyterian. But I grew up looking at a lot of these revival Christian sort of services and gospel services in the mountains. So when it came time to think about an opera, I gravitated to this story, which I know, I always feel, and I tell my students to write what you know, and it was a story and a subject matter that I knew something about. So that's what gave me the um, idea. Unfortunately, then I met Herschel Garfien, who's the librettist for the opera, and we definitely want to give a shout out to him because he was a big part of the success of the opera. Was Herschel being a willing participant in the creation of the operatic version of Elmer Gantry.
So, going off of that, speaking of Herschel Garfien, is there a way? What is the process that you two have when coming up with an opera? Is there any one formula that you follow, or is it very free, or do you have like with the amount of time that you spent with him, do you kind of have it down to a science almost, or is it a little more free flowing?
Well, it changed as time went on. I mean, I started working with Herschel in 1990, so that's a long time. And if I think most of the time, in terms of the process, the words usually are written first. There were
Mm-hmm.
only a couple of numbers where I wrote the music first, and Herschel wrote the words to the music that I had already written. But other than that, it was words first, and then it was sort of the history of telecommunications. He would send them to me, sometimes by post. Then when the fax machine came in, he would fax them to me. And then when computers came in, he would send them to me via computer. So we started off working on Elmer Gantry in the same room for a lot of times. He came and stayed with us for a month at the beginning, and we started writing the opera then, including the aria that you're going to sing, Sharon's aria.
So, just for the viewers, what is the context of Sharon's aria? Like, where does it happen in the opera, and what gave you the idea to write this aria?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, Sharon Falconer is the main female character. Elmer Gantry is the main male character. Sharon was as an evangelist minister, a traveling evangelist, and she was based on the historical character of Aimee Semple McPherson, who at the time was an extremely well-known minister. And Sinclair Lewis was a journalist, so he took almost everything he took in terms of the influence of the characters in the story was from him, approaching it like a journalist, but then writing this novel, which became very successful at the time. But it was a very sharp critique of evangelism. Because both of us came from religious background, Herschel being Jewish and came from an Orthodox Jewish background in some sense, and me being a minister's son, we both wanted to show the problems with organized religion, but also the beauty of it. So we took a slightly different path than the movie or the novel. And Sharon's aria, this is her entrance into the opera itself. Elmer leaves where he is and goes to a revival tent meeting just because there's nothing else to do. And he sees this woman marching into her tent for the revival meeting, and she's extremely charismatic, just as Aimee Semple McPherson was. There were stories of Aimee Semple McPherson in Los Angeles, where she did a lot of her work, sitting down on a street corner, just sitting in the middle of the street and starting to speak, starting to pray. And gradually people came from all over, and she would draw these huge, huge crowds. So we wanted to give some of that sense of this woman's sort of mystical and charismatic ability. So in Sharon's aria, we wanted it to be very simple, but very compelling. And it's that idea that sometimes instead of people speaking at the top of their lungs trying to be charismatic, they speak very softly and they draw you in. And that's the character of the aria that we wanted, that she was just drawing people in by this very powerful presence. And so that was a lot of the idea for the aria, which is extremely simple. And what were some of the challenges you had with learning that?
Well, because, it's very non-traditional with in the context of opera, because you have, if you're listening to the opera by itself, there's a lot of like this very lush, almost like Wagnerian level singing. But then you get to this scene where it kind of just, it's very straightforward. It's like, I don't want to say it's like pop music, but it's like, I think a good example of this would be, I think, I'm not sure if anyone, this was a pretty popular album, but Aretha Franklin's album of Amazing Grace that she did with I forget which church it was, but it was very much like that. So when I've been listening to Sharon's aria, I actually, would, sometimes like listen to that album, or like it's even in the, it even sounds kind of like a spiritual almost. So like, and having, I remember you always, used to tell singers singing is like no vibrato, no vibrato, no vibrato, which, for all of our training, we're told to just vibrate everything. So just having to go back to just, this very simple, very, I think I want to say natural, but I think in the best sense that, it's not overdone, it's not too theatrical, it's just singing.
Yeah, I agree, and that's what singers oftentimes have problems with both Herschel and I coaching because we want more and more straight tone, and someone thinks that they're doing straight tone, an opera singer, and they're not actually, because as you say, they're not trained. No one goes to a voice lesson and says, "Okay, sing this with straight tone." It's just not just the way a violin teacher hardly ever, if ever, teaches pizzicato to a violinist. They're always playing arco, bow technique, but pizzicato is an important technique that if you don't know how to do well, it's going to be very evident. But so in this aria, yes, I wanted a lot of straight tone, but towards the end of the aria, it gets very full. So you need a singer who has the simplicity of voice, but then at the end has this huge climactic voice. The vibrato can come in gradually and then just overtake at the end. So, and that's what, the mezzo we wrote it for was Lorraine Hunt, who later became Lorraine Hunt Lieberson, and this was in the 90s. Tragically, she died many years ago, but she was a fantastic inspiration for this. And then I know you were influenced by her, and in deciding also to become an opera singer. So, and then when you sing it, you have that simplicity. It's in your blood to want to sing in that simple way, but also then have the operatic chops too. To me, the ideal singer is someone that can be very simple and can fill out the sound whenever they want, but great American diction, not American diction faking an English accent, right? But real American diction. So that's always our goal. So we end up coaching singers probably a little too much to get them to sing in the way that we imagine, and that Aretha Franklin album, which was recorded in church. Her father was a minister, famous minister, and she would sing in the church, and that's how she became famous. That her voice from the time she was 8 or 9 became spectacular, but she also had that ability to just sing very softly and then just full throttle.
Right. It just draws you in, even like she could just sing the smallest sound, but you're still like
riveted. Right?
Yeah. So in talking about Elmer Gantry in general, what was the process of that getting off the ground? I know it's a little long and a little it's not as straightforward as most people might think how an opera gets produced.
Not at all. It took 18 years from the time we started to get a full stage production in Nashville. We were sort of turned down by almost every opera company along the road. We started in Boston, and then when they dropped the project Boston Lyric Opera, we traveled around and met with almost every company, every large company in the country, all the way out to Seattle and San Francisco.
You were just like door-to-door opera salesman.
That's right, we were. That's right, we were trying to hawk our opera, and finally we met John Humes of Nashville Opera, and he was very interested. He himself came from that evangelist background, and he's a stage director and did a brilliant job of bringing it to life because he had so much connection to that tradition. And so Nashville Opera did the premiere in 2007, and then it was done where I taught before Rutgers at Montclair State University, and you were in it. In the chorus, and when you were 13, I think.
Yeah, I was 13, I think.
And that was another very inspirational thing, both for me and I think for you, to have my daughter in the opera, my first opera, and so it was a really thrilling event to have the same production in Nashville, but come to Montclair where the chorus was different. But the principles were the same as in Nashville.
So you talk. What inspirations drew you the most as a composer? Like stuff like Elmer Gantry, like when you're writing other things as well, like what do you find yourself drawn to the most when writing?
I mean, some composers have very fixed ideas. They always want an extra musical subject, something to do with nature or stories or whatever. I can sometimes do that, and I've certainly written tone poems and things based on stories. I also take things just from the music itself, abstract, so it's just I write something and I like it and I keep going. So it's not based on something. Sometimes I'm inspired by people, both love of people, love of a particular person, or or a group of people, or some kind of idea. Once in a while, it is nature. It's sort of eclectic. It's not one formula for me starting and sticking to a piece.
And what in particular draws you to opera as an art?
Oh my! Well, I didn't know that much about it. I went through training, and I got a master's degree at New England Conservatory in 1980, but really had written very little vocal music. It wasn't until 10 years later that I started coming up with the idea for Elmer Gantry being an opera, and then I started watching a lot of opera. Mostly Mozart da Ponte was a huge
Sure.
influence because those are just brilliant. Those last three or four operas he did with da Ponte were just genius, and so I got to know those before I got to know the heavy duty operatic tradition of Wagner and Verdi, Puccini. So that was my grounding, and with Herschel too. So we would go to operas and we would study them, and one of the big things was to say, hold it, what do we want to do in this that no one has done? So, for instance, just small things like in Marriage of Figaro, there's a septet where two people are on the stage, and then it grows to seven. So we said, well, let's start with one and go to eight, just because it'll be a little bit bigger that way. So that was what's called the new wine octet. It's new wine has to go in new bottles, not in old. It's a passage from the Bible. So, I sort of crazy things like that, where we just decided we want to do something this way. And also, because in American opera, there's so many things that aren't, like European opera, for instance, gospel music itself,
Right.
and the idea of having church services, gospel services in a tent, it's a very American idea, right? And then at the end, it's sort of in this, the last scene of the opera is in this crystal palace that Elmer and Sharon build that burns down at the end of the opera, and sort of is like American, Gouda d'Amoron, but but with the burning down crystal palace of this huge tabernacle. So I guess the answer to that is a little bit of everything.
So, speaking of other vocal music, what other vocal works have you written, and you have one opera that's already another opera that came after it, and do you have anything planned for the future?
So the second opera happened a lot faster than the first. It took us
Right.
in total about 5 years instead of 18. The 18 wasn't, of course, always writing it. We took a couple of years off at a time when we couldn't get anyone to bite for putting on an opera. But operas are so expensive, and it takes a lot for a company to invest, particularly in a new work, when they know they can fill the hall doing Carmen or Puccini.
Right.
So opera companies have to take a risk with new work. But the second opera was based on a novel also, Sister Carrie, and it was a Theodore Dreiser novel, 1900 it was written. It was famous at the time. What's good about writing an opera based on something, particularly if it was well known at one point, but then sort of forgotten. Both Sister Carrie and Elmer Gantry fall into that category. Dreiser was also a journalist, and as Elmer Gantry was. So, if you look at the top 50 or 100 novels of American novels, if you Google it, you'll see both Elmer Gantry and Sister Carrie on that list, but they're rarely taught anymore in schools. And in Sister Carrie's case, there was a movie, but it was a pretty bad movie, so not many people saw it, so it was easy to start and tell our own story based on the Dreiser book. So that was started in 2011, and then the premiere was 2016.
Yeah, much shorter.
Done by Florentine Opera in Milwaukee. So that was again, writing with Herschel.
So you said, because you teach at Rutgers and you teach composition at the Rutgers Music Department, what is something that you always tell your students other than write what you know?
Yeah, write what you know. I mean, that phrase comes from writing classes, actually, prose writing novels or poems or what. If you go into any first class introduction to writing, the teacher will say, write what you know. And usually people's first stories are take an experience that you have and write after that, because that's so I always try to get students to take, okay, what is it that you love? What kind of music do you love? Where is it? What do you love about it? And so we start there. A lot of times students feel like they have to start somewhere else, like if they want to write, okay, they have to imitate Mozart or Shostakovich or somebody, instead of taking what they know and writing. So a lot of students these days, and even for the time I've been composing, pop music, rock music has been something that they immediately love and are involved in to some way, just like I was. So the same way I began with, writing things that I knew and I was familiar with, I encouraged them to do the same thing, because that gives you this center, and then you grow from there. And no one would listen to my music and say, wow, that's pop music or that's rock music, but the influences of that on my music are undeniable, underneath, because that's where I started.
I think that's a big thing with American classical music. You see it. I'm not saying that European classical music doesn't draw from other traditions, but I think American classical music it feels so diverse in the different, in its origins. And it's of course, it obviously borrows from European traditions, but there are so many, it's kind of just this melting pot of other traditions that are thrown in there as well.
Yeah, well, America is known as the melting pot of
Right.
the world, where people came from all over the world and still do, because it's a country that was built on the idea of religious freedom, personal freedoms that other cultures didn't have. And I think that's something that goes a lot of ways. So American music is eclectic, I think, and so for the compositional styles to be eclectic is a natural thing.
Right.
For too many years, we followed the European models and didn't break away. So whereas in literature, you have people like Hawthorne, Mark Twain, in the Walt Whitman, who were in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1800s, created an American language that was very different than Europe. But in music, that didn't start happening until like Aaron Copland, really,
Right.
and Charles Ives a little earlier, but nobody knew, that music. So music is always, I think, stylistically lags behind the other arts. But ultimately now, I think one of the exciting things about music and teaching music and writing music is it's very eclectic and people can choose whatever they want. When I was in school, it was the tail end of, you had to either write like Stravinsky or Schoenberg, and that was a really bad period, because you don't want to have to be reduced to like following one composer or another because they were prominent at the time. Now then you could name two or three great composers at the time. Now you could name 20 or 30 or 200 because there are just so many people doing good work in all different directions and all different styles.
Do you have any advice to composers who are trying to break into the world of opera?
Don't. Actually,
I wouldn't say that.
actually, I think you just have to. My advice would be you have to really want to do it because it's so hard. It's hard to write an opera, but then to sell the opera and to get people to do it and invest in it, it's so expensive. If you write a string quartet or a piano and voice piece, it's relatively cheap and inexpensive, and you can get people to do it, or even hire professionals. But it's still inexpensive to put on an opera. It's crazy
Right.
expensive, and so you have to be dedicated to not only the writing of the opera, but the actual selling of it can overtake you, and you have to be completely fearless about
Sure.
doing that because it's so much more expensive than any other medium. I guess that the only thing to compare it to is filmmaking because that's very expensive as well, but it is a completely different art form. Opera, at the end of the day, has long been the high water mark of culture, Western culture. And when Herschel and I were at the Grammys, and we fortunately won for the recording of Elmer Gantry, this was in 2013, so 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, we went into a room with a gaggle of reporters and light bulbs, and all these people that preceded us were rock and pop people, and we were. A reporter asked, "Why are you doing opera and not stuff like Beyonce?" And my answer was, "Well, if you look at the history of opera, it's since Monteverdi in 1609." It's long been considered the high water mark of culture because it combines theater, music, sets, lighting. The almost every type of art is involved in making an opera, and once you sort of get the bug for that, it's very hard to let that any. It seems like lots of composers then become addicted to it and have in the past because it's such an exciting art form. And then there are famous examples of composers who didn't do so well in the opera world. Someone like Beethoven, he wrote one opera that's not a great success. If it weren't Beethoven, I'm sure Fidelio would never be done. Schubert never had any success.
Right.
But yet the opera is where people made money. Verdi was a millionaire based on writing his operas. Puccini, same, was very successful. So most composers want to get into writing an opera, but some are successful in doing that, and then some aren't.
I think you just have to accept that, like, sometimes it's not going to be as easy as you think it might be, right?
Right, and some composers just aren't, built for writing operas in terms of, loving the stage, loving, the craft of, the stage and storytelling by virtue of theater.
You do have to have a big appreciation for live theater.
Absolutely, there's no substitute for that.
Right. If you would like to listen to Elmer Gantry and the music of Dr. Robert Livingston Aldridge, please come to Marshall Opera's second Oral History Project concert, Saturday, April 27th at 2 p.m. at the Bruno Walter Auditorium in Lincoln Center.
And you'll get to hear my daughter Micaela singing the first aria that I wrote with Herschel Garfein, the librettist, from Elmer Gantry, my first opera.
Thank you for tuning in.